Welcome. This is Raul Lowry Contreras, and this is the Contreras Report, Mexico edition. Yes, today we're going to talk about Mexico again because some very interesting things are going on down here. The President of Mexico, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, I'll call him by his nickname, AMLO, threatens to pursue constitutional change if the electricity law that he has proposed for the national electrical generation, he wants to take it away or keep private enterprise from getting into it. Private enterprise now brings in or turns over to the state 49% of all electrical generation in the country. It's done through private companies, mostly with solar energy, green energy, and he doesn't like that. And as a matter of fact, he's trying to get a law passed to get the Federal Electricity Commission, and the initials, the acronym in Mexico is CFE, which I will refer to it now as CFE. He wants to give CFE 100% control over electrical generation and transmission in Mexico. 100%. Okay. CFE, it costs CFE about $127 a megawatt hour to produce and transmit 1 megawatt hour, $127 American. Okay, keep that number in mind. But the private enterprise produces solar energy and puts it into the system for $1.25 a megawatt hour. That's 100 times less. And AMLO doesn't like that. He thinks that the private enterprise companies that got those contracts, mostly Spanish companies, some Canadian, some American, that they paid huge bribes to get these contracts. Well, number one, he offers no proof of that. It's just his word. Number two, the fact of the matter is that it still only costs private enterprise $1.25 a megawatt hour. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, 2 judges in the past week have granted injunctions against the president's bill. Now, we're talking about news that was published on Wednesday, March 17th. So this is current stuff. President Lopez Obrador threatens to send a bill to Congress to change the Constitution if his new electricity law that prioritizes state-owned Federal Electricity Commission energy over private companies is deemed by the courts, or continues to be deemed by the courts, to be unconstitutional. The new electricity industry law, which gives CFE-generated power priority on the national grid over that produced by private and renewable energy companies, took effect last week. But it was promptly suspended by a judge who ruled that it could harm competition and cause irreparable damage to the environment. A second judge ruled against the law on Tuesday, the 16th, in response to the 11 injunction requests filed by private companies. Speaking at his every morning news conference, Lopez Obrador said he was certain the law was not unconstitutional, before indicating that he would seek to change the Constitution if judges, including the Supreme Court of Mexico, rule that it is unconstitutional. Quote, if judges, magistrates, justices determine it is unconstitutional and it can't continue, I would send an initiative to reform the Constitution because I cannot be an accomplice to robbery, unquote, says President AMLO, in reaffirming his claim that the previous government, which ended a long-held state monopoly in the energy sector, allowed private and foreign companies to, quote, loot and steal. The news agency Reuters, the international news agency, reported that some lawyers do not believe that the law, which is seen as a barrier to investment and could trigger clashes with the United States, will be ruled unconstitutional if the government can provide sufficient guarantees to companies with existing energy sector investments in Mexico. In other words, bribes them with goodies. That point of view is pretty dumb if one looks to a prosperous Mexico in the future with billions of dollars invested from Europe, the United States, Canada, and Asian nations like South Korea and Japan. Lopez Obrador didn't indicate the exact nature of the constitutional change he would pursue, but expressed confidence that his government would be able to enact one. Quote, "What do we need?" he asks. 2/3 of the Congress. It's good that the June elections are coming. They, the opposition parties, are betting that we won't get a majority in the Chamber of Deputies so they can continue maintaining privileges and continue maintaining the regime of corruption. But the people are wise, unquote, says Lopez Obrador. Lopez Obrador can say some really stupid things. He says he needs 2/3 to pass a constitutional amendment. That's true. But he doesn't have that now and has little chance to get it in the election, in both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. Is he going to lie to Mexicans by stating that electricity from the CFE, the government agency that costs over $120 per megawatt hour, while privately generated electricity costs $100 less? The president's Morena party and its allies, the Social Encounter and Labor parties, don't currently have the votes among them to get the 2/3 majority required. Let's be clear about that. They don't have the majority, 2/3, required to pass the law in the two-chamber Congress. But even if they get that, they have to submit it to the states and get 2/3 of the states. There's 33 states in Mexico, including Mexico City. They would have to get 2/3 of those states. Well, he might get Baja California because his party runs it, but he's not going to get the 9 parties that are run by the PAN, the Panistas. The president said he was unconcerned about the accumulation of rulings against the electricity law, but reiterated that the judges that hand them down should be investigated. Oh, shades of Donald Trump. The Mexican judiciary, allegedly, has been and is independent. But he doesn't want to recognize that. He wants them investigated if they rule against him. Does that sound familiar? The law has been thrown out by every single judge that has ruled on it since it was introduced last year. Quote, public life has to be more and more public. Transparency is a golden rule of democracy, and there shouldn't be untouchables. The president of Mexico has no immunity from prosecution now. He can be investigated for any crime that didn't happen before. If that's the way it is with the president, why not with other public servants? Says the president of Mexico, Lopez Obrador. The president wrote last week to Supreme Court Chief Justice Arturo Saldivar to ask that the judge who ruled against the electricity law be investigated. Well, in U.S. terms, that's BS. What did Judge Saldivar say? An investigation will proceed if there's evidence, the judge said. Lopez Obrador said Monday he had asked the Federal Judiciary Council, the CJF, to determine whether the court in which the judge sits, an administrative court that specializes in economic competition, broadcasting, and telecommunication matters, has the authority to suspend the law. He said an investigation into the judge is necessary because there are, quote, people, organizations, and companies, unquote, that are close to the old political regime. Quote, they act based on their well-known economic and political interests and use corruption and influence peddling as their modus operandi, Lopez Obrador says. He specifically cited Spanish energy firm Iberdrola, for which former President Felipe Calderón, a lawyer, and his energy minister Georgina Kessel, another lawyer, have worked. Zaldivar responded to the president's request for an investigation in his own letter, which the CJF made public on Monday afternoon, in which he made it clear that an investigation would only proceed if there was evidence of wrongdoing. Quote, as is appropriate in these cases, your complaint will be sent to the relevant area of the Federal Judiciary Council so that an investigation is opened if there is evidence for that to occur, unquote. So wrote Chief Judge Zaldivar. He added that democracy and the rule of law are built on judges' capacity to make decisions within a, quote, framework of autonomy and independence, unquote. The Chief Justice told the President that it is the job of the Federal Judiciary Council to ensure that judges can freely do that while making certain they act in accordance with the law and with, quote, honor, honesty, and complete impartiality, which we will continue to fulfill this mandate, Zaldivar wrote. Now, for those of you who really want to get into details, the Reforma newspaper, Reuters, and Milenio, which is a television, Mexican television, Spanish CNN type operation, have more details. I bring this up because what we have here is a clear demarcation between state-owned whatever, in this case electrical generation, electricity, and private enterprise in the same field. They compete against each other. Obviously, the federal government of Mexico cannot compete with the private enterprise, which is much more efficient, much more modern, and is not responsible for transmitting the electricity and getting it to the customers, to the people of Mexico. A few weeks ago, there was a huge blackout that covered 12 entire states. That's more than 1/3 of all of Mexico was completely shut down with no electricity. Now, the two things wrong with that. Number one, this happened in Texas, just north of Mexico, not long ago, during that big freeze. We do recall that. And it was done for the same reason. In other words, private enterprise in the Texas case was sort of shunted aside, and instead of Texas being part of the national American grid, actually there's two large grids, the west and the east, and then there's Texas by itself. So they got caught, and the poor people of Texas suffered mightily. Okay, well, the poor people of Mexico suffered mightily a few weeks ago when 12 states lost their power. There was no way to hook them up into a national grid. In Baja California, where I am, we're not hooked up to the national grid. And we have problems with electricity here every once in a while. I think since I've lived here the past 2 years, I've had blackouts 3 or 4 times, once for a whole day. And that was because of wind storms, serious wind storms. And they just blow wires down. And that happens everywhere. And but most of the time it's very dependable. We get our grid, we're actually hooked into the California grid. And electricity generated in Baja California by solar, wind turbines, and solar and wind turbines actually sold to San Diego to fill the gap there whenever they need it. So we have quite a nice little system here in the Californias, which they don't have nationally in Mexico. So the whole thing needs to be reformed, and as much as possible keep the government out of it. But as far as generation is concerned, 49% of all electricity in Mexico is now generated by private companies. And that is good. That is not bad. That is a very good situation to be in, because we can increase that over a period of time. It's good because Mexico has to import oil and gasoline from the United States of America. Yes, Mexico, a major oil producer in the world has to import oil from the United States of America because its refineries are only working at 38% of capacity. 38% of capacity. Why? The basic reason? Pemex is owned by the government. Pemex is owned by the government. Yes. Now, if Pemex were portioned off to private partners, they could increase that. The first thing that AMLO did when he became president was order that a new refinery be built in his home state. Yeah, that's clean. But speaking of corruption, that's the first example of corruption in the Obrador presidency, the first one, because he announced that right off the bat. Second proof of corruption is there are two videos in existence that I have seen, and so has the rest of Mexico through television, where a relative of Lopez Obrador has his hand out getting paper bags full of cash, supposedly for political activity of AMLO's personal political party. That's his relative getting hundreds of thousands of pesos in cash. Second evidence of corruption. The third evidence of corruption is AMLO has a younger brother who plays professional baseball in Mexico, in the Mexican League. He plays for a team in the state of Chiapas, is the most southern state in Mexico. It abuts Guatemala. And it's home to the Lacandon Forest, which is the only rainforest in North America, a big coffee producer, home of the Maya Indians that revolted in 1994, and a very scenic place. They play baseball there. So what did the federal government do recently? That's AMLO's government. They pumped millions of pesos into refurbishing the ballpark there where his brother plays. Third proof of corruption. And of course, as I said, trying to steal legitimate contracts that were exercised, that were written and exercised and executed by the previous administration to open up electrical generation to private enterprise on a contract and bidding basis. He wants to do away with that because he says those contracts came about because of corruption. I gave you 3 instances of AMLO's personal corruption and his political party's corruption. His man in Baja California, who ran for governor 2 years ago, ran for a 2-year term. They were readjusting the 6-year term to coincide with the national presidential election instead of being off-year elections. And so they did a special 2-year term so they could do that in the future, next time around. And so AMLO's personal friend and a guy that I know very well, Jaime Bonilla, ran for that 2-year term. And in the process, the people of Baja California decided to make the term a 5-year term, the next term, a 5-year term, so it would fit the presidential every 6-year election term, okay? So what did he do? He claimed that he got elected for 5 years. He ran for a 2-year term. It went into the courts, because that's what he was claiming. It was put into the courts by lawsuits, and the Supreme Court said no. The people fully understood it was a 2-year term. That's what they voted for. So the little political detour that he wanted to take to a 5-year term didn't come to pass. Proof number 4 of corruption by President Lopez Obrador, his party, and his friends. That's it for today. If you have any comments, at the end of the program, you'll see my address, hispaniccomentator@gmail.com. Send us any questions you want or comments, and I'll repeat them here on the air. Subscribe to this program, to this Mexico edition, and you'll be notified every time that we post a new edition. Just subscribe on YouTube or Facebook. If you have anything you want to input, send me an email. In the meantime, I will continue to be Raul Lowry Contreras. This is the Contreras Report, Mexico edition. Until next time, thank you.